Okay, now we're going to be learning the quadratic formula. Okay, questions 11 through 16. We're going to talk about the quadratic formula to solve each equation with the quadratic formula. You guys know how to solve a few methods. I know before we talk about how to solve by factoring, right? We did factoring. Then we also graphed. We graphed it and you guys were able to solve it. Then we also learned how to solve by completing the squared. Now I'm going to say those are good methods. If you guys want to stick to one of those, by all means, stick to it. Now the quadratic formula, let me mention the quadratic formula. Let me give you guys a formula. We talked yesterday how to find like A, B, C values. Now my formula, let me write it down. As a matter of fact, I'm going to write it as a story. We also call it the bad boy formula. So there's a bad boy. You guys see that negative B because it's a bad boy. This bad boy went to a so-called, so like yes or no, we call it plus or minus. Keep in mind, there's a plus or minus, so when I solve it, I'm going to have two answers. So remember, a bad boy went to a so-called radical party. We know the radical is this side. Now, inside the party, because the boy was being squared, he lost a chance. Now, don't get offended for what's coming up. It's just to help us learn the formula. He lost a chance with 4. This doesn't quite write down. Let's see. He lost a chance with 4 awesome chicks. Okay. He lost a chance with 4 awesome chicks. Now, everything was over. Now, in math, when we say over, we tend to write it as a fraction, was over at 2 a.m. So a bad boy went to a so-called radical party because the boy was being squared. He lost a chance with 4 awesome chicks. Now, everything was over at 2 a.m. Now, you guys have seen this formula before. Probably your teacher was doing this song or just had you memorize it. Now, this formula, sometimes we tend to write x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Now, the hard part of the quadratic formula, to be honest, the hard part is the square root. B squared minus 4ac. Yesterday, we saw this as the discriminant. Okay, so I'll come back to this formula in a minute. Meanwhile, let me write here, the question number 11. I want to write everything on the left side. I want the right side to be 0. So let me rewrite this as n squared. I'm going to go n squared minus 6n minus 112 is equal to 0. Notice the 6n, I moved it way over there. Don't forget to switch the sign. Now, yesterday we learned that my a was going to be 1, my b was going to be a negative 6, and my c was a negative 112. Right? Because yesterday we're looking at the discriminant. Now, coming back to the formula, the quadratic formula, I said the hard part is the discriminant. All right, so let me figure out what my discriminant is. I know for my discriminant, I have the formula b squared minus 4 times a times c. Right, that's the hard part. So let me just work on that first. So I have negative 6 all squared minus 4 times 1 times a negative 112. I know negative 6 squared is 36. When I look at my multiplication, there is a negative sign. So what I'm going to do with my negative sign, I'm just going to bring it to the front and change this minus to a plus sign. And then I have to figure out what's 4 times 1 times 112. In my case, I get 448. Now, when I get 36 plus 448, I get 484. I found my discriminant. Now, let me get the square root of that, right? What number multiplied by itself gives me 484? So I'm going to get my square root of this. The square root of 484 happens to be 22. And so far, I did the hard part of my quadratic formula. Let me zoom out. Let me zoom out. So I see my quadratic formula starts with a negative b. My b was a negative 6. So the negative of a negative is positive 6. Plus or minus 22. Right? I did the whole radical. I did the whole square root of b squared minus 4ac. I did the hard part at the side, so I'm not going to do it again. At the bottom of my fraction, 2 times a, so that's 2. Since a is 1, 2 times a is 2. Okay. Now, one thing I'm going to do, I see my numbers here, my whole numbers. They can all be divided by 2, right? I'm going to simplify my numbers first. I see that everything can be divided by 2. So I'm going to see this as 3 plus or minus 11 over 1. See how I divided everything by 2? Now, one thing that I know is that when I have a fraction, and in my fraction I have a 1 at the bottom, it's not a fraction anymore. So my answer is 3 plus or minus 11. Now, here it says solve. Okay, so I need to find out my solutions. In this case, my solutions, my answers will be 14 and negative 8. Right? 3 plus 11 and 3 minus 11. That's it. The hard part was the discriminant. Okay, let's take a look at question number 12. Let me zoom in to number 12. To begin with, let me move everything to the left side. So I have 4v squared minus 8v plus 8 is equal to 0. Do notice that these two terms, I switched the signs, right? Guys, I moved everything to the left side. And when I mean left side or right side, is of the equal sign. Okay, so based on this, my A is 4, my B is a negative 8, and my C is positive 8. Let me find my discriminant. Remember, B squared minus 4 times A times C. So I'm going to go negative 8 all squared minus 4 times 4 times 8. All right. Negative 8 all squared, that's 64, right? Negative 8 times negative 8 is 64. Minus, might as well, let me take a look at this multiplication here by itself. So 4 times 4 times 8 is 128. So 64 minus 128 gives me negative 64. Okay, my discriminant is negative. It's fine. My solutions will be imaginary. Now let's get the square root of negative 64. I know we saw this before. This looks like the square root of a negative 1 times the square root of 64, right? Notice how my negative, I split it. When we talk about I, remember the imaginary number, we said that the square root of negative 1 was I. I know the square root of 64 is 8. Plus or minus, because we're doing the square root. But let me just say this is going to simplify to plus or minus 8i. We tend to write the number before the letter, right? The square root of negative 64 is 8i. Okay, now let me zoom out so we see the formula. You guys see the formula on top. Negative b. My b is a negative 8. So negative of a negative, I'm going to say positive 8 plus or minus 8i all over 2 times a, so I get 8. Let me take a look on my whole numbers. I feel like I can divide them all by 8, right? Let me simplify this. So I get 1 plus or minus 1i all over 1. I just said that when we have a fraction and there's a 1 at the bottom, it's not a fraction anymore. So I'm just going to write this as 1 plus or minus. Now 1i, we don't write the 1. So it's just I. So 1 plus or minus I. So my solutions will be 1 plus I and 1 minus I. Now those cannot be combined because 1 is a real number and I is an imaginary number. Okay, interesting. Okay, let's take a look at question number 13. Let me move everything to the left, right? So I have 2n squared plus 7n plus 8 is equal to 0. Don't forget to switch the signs and don't forget to write this in order, exponents in order. So I have that my A is 2, my B is 7, and my C is 8. I'm going to deal my discriminant first, right? B squared minus 4 times A times C. So I have 7 squared minus 4 times 2 times 8. I know 7 squared is 49 minus, okay, so I did my exponent first, minus, my minus basically separates things. So now what's 4 times 2 times 8? Well, that's 64. What's 49 minus 64? Well, that's negative 15. Okay, so I have 49 minus 64. That's a negative 15. Now, can we do the square root of that? Because now that I find my discriminant, let me find the square root of that. Now, I know that I can break this as the square root of negative 1, the square root of 15, because the square root of negative 1 will be I. Now, square root of 15. Yeah, that one I cannot split out. So let me just say this is going to be I radical 15. I say we tend to write the number before the I, but not when the number is the radical. If you can simplify the radical, by all means do so. Okay, what do I mean with that? If I had the square root of 18, let me write something over here. The square root of 18, that simplifies to 3 radical 2. Right? We talked about before how to simplify a radical. Now, radical 15 cannot be simplified. So that's my square root, right? Plus or minus I radical 15. Okay, now remember my formula. As a matter of fact, for us to not be able to zooming out that much, I remember my formula was a bad boy went to a so-called radical party. The boy was being square, so he lost a chance with 4 awesome chicks. Everything was over at 2 a.m. So for me to find my answer, negative b, so let me just write negative 7 plus or minus I radical 15 over. Now 2 times a gives me 4. Look at your whole numbers. If you can simplify, by all means do so. Nothing I can do. It is still a fraction because my answer at the bottom, it's a whole number and it other than 1. So it is still a fraction. My solutions will be negative 7 plus I radical 15 over 4. And my other solution would be -7 minus I radical 15 over 4. Notice that my difference was plus or minus, right? Now, some of you might be thinking, oh, Lee Smokes, how am I going to type this? Okay. The top of the fraction, I have to put it inside of a parentheses. So I'm going to say that's going to be the top of my fraction. And then inside of my parentheses, -7 plus I rad 15. I know it looks like two parentheses closing at the same time. Okay. Over, so over 4. My other answer, I'm going to put that in parentheses. I'm going to have -7 minus I radical 15, everything over 4. Yeah, you will have to type some of these in your homework. That's what I'm going over, because so you guys know how to type this out. All right, let's take a look at number 14. I'm going to solve this. Let me move everything to the left. So I have 4p squared minus 8p minus 32. It's equal to 0. So based on this, my A is 4, my B is a -8, and my C is a -32. I'm going to work my discriminant first. B squared minus 4 times A times C. So I have -8 squared minus 4 times 4 times a -32. So I have 64, right? Because -8 squared. Now I have a minus here. My multiplication after the minus, my multiplication has a minus sign in there. There's a negative in there. So I'm gonna bring it to the very front. So that becomes a plus. And then I'm just gonna go 4 times 4 times 32. So it's 512. Now 64 plus 512 is 576. Right? My discriminant is 576. Now, what's the square root of 576? My case, 24. Let me zoom out a little. Let me remind you guys of the formula. The formula is right here. So negative b, because b was -8, the negative of a negative is +8, plus or minus 24. All of this is over at 2 times a, so 8. Now this is going to simplify to 1 plus or minus 3 over 1. The reason why it is because I looked at my whole numbers and I noticed that I could divide them all by 8. So it was 1 plus or minus 3 over 1. It is not a fraction anymore because there's a 1 at the bottom. So my answer is 1 plus or minus 3. So my two solutions will be 4 and -2. Right? 1 plus 3 and 1 minus 3. Quadratic formula tends to be hard at the beginning. So let me do 2 more examples. Let's take a look at question number 15. I'm going to rewrite everything on the left side. So let me write this as 2m squared plus 0m plus 8 is equal to 0. Do notice that I moved that -8, so I wrote it as a +8. Remember, I need 3 terms. So do notice that for my m, I put a 0m. So based on that, I know my A is 2, my B is 0, and my C is 8. And I remember my discriminant, B squared minus 4AC. Right? The boy was being squared, so he lost a chance with 4 awesome chicks. So I have 0 squared minus 4 times 2 times 8. I know 0 squared is 0 minus 4 times 2 times 8 is 64. I know 0 minus 64 is negative 64. So my discriminant is negative. One thing I'm even going to do here, which I've been doing for the quadratic formula, let me get the square root of that. I know this looks like the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 64. So it's I8, which is better known as 8I. Okay, I remember my quadratic formula, right? A bad boy went to a so-called radical party. The boy was being squared, so he lost a chance with 4 awesome chicks. Everything was over at 2 a.m. So negative B, so let me just write this as a negative 0 plus or minus 8I. I just figured that out. 8I over 4. Remember, it's 2 times A, so over 4. I see my whole numbers. I can divide them all by 4. Yeah, 0 divided by 4 is doable. So that gives me negative 0 plus or minus 2I over 1. Right? I divided everything by 4. 0 can be divided by 4. So this is not a fraction anymore. So I have negative 0 plus or minus 2I. Now, my answer would, in reality, my answers would be 2I and negative 2I. Right? Negative 0, in addition, 0 does nothing, so I'm not even going to worry about this. So my answers are 2I and negative 2I. Now let's take a look at our last example. Let me rewrite this as 3k squared plus 4k minus 55 is equal to 0. So my A value is 3, my B value is 4, and my C value is a negative 55. Let me work on my discriminant first. B squared minus 4 times A times C. So I have 4 squared minus 4 times 3 times a negative 55. I know 4 squared is 16 minus. In my multiplication, I see a negative sign. I'm going to bring it to the front, so it's plus I now. 4 times 3 times 55 is 660. So my discriminant will be 676. Okay, cool. I expect 2 real solutions then. Now the square root of 676 is 26. Right, positive or negative 26. Okay, so I did the hard part. Coming back to my formula, negative b, so I'm going to write this as a negative 4 plus or minus 26 over 2 times a, so that's 6. I see my numbers. I can divide them all by 2. So I have negative 2 plus or minus 13 over 3. Okay, I still have a fraction. So my answers would be negative 2 plus 13 over 3 and negative 2 minus 13 over 3. So that means I should simplify my fractions. I know negative 2 plus 13, right? That's 11. So my first answer is 11 over 3. My second answer, negative 2 minus 13 is a negative 15. So I'm going to write this as a negative 15 over 3. Now, that can be done better, right? I'm going to call that negative 5, right? Negative 15 over 3. If you do have a fraction, make sure you bring that negative to the very front of the fraction. But 15 over 3, I'm just going to call it 5. So my answers are 11 over 3 and negative 5.